Yes, indeed, folks, the sounds of the legendary let's try again. Frank Klepacki! Oh, yes. Who has kindly given us the permission to keep these songs in the archives. Oh, yes, he is a wonderful man, I must say. I enjoyed a lot of his stuff way back in the day with actually June 2000, where he did some of the remixes there. Brilliant, absolutely fantastic stuff. My name is Tall Biscuit, and you listen to Blue Please here on WoW Radio. And yes, I do have a sore throat, and it's likely my voice will burn out before the end of the show, but I'm going to persevere on regardless and see what happens. Right. Some of you may be aware, specifically those of you who have stairs in your house, that something interesting happened in a little game by the name of EVE Online a few days back. Now, the first question, of course, that you're now asking me is, well, why the hell are you talking about EVE Online? Well, I think it's actually pertinent when it comes to looking at WoW, to have a look at other games in the genre, and to do a comparison. And basically, it helps you have a look at WoW a bit more objectively, and that seems a little bit odd, considering you're looking at other stuff. It's like, oh, well, surely you're looking at it now relatively, but the idea of having an objective perspective on WoW and to try and take all of the emotion out of it and try and determine which bits of WoW are good and which bits aren't does involve looking at the other things in the genre. Now, EVE, of course, is another MMO and it's space-based, so it's not quite the same by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's probably the furthest away from WoW you could possibly get. Now, what happened in this game? Now, just to give you a little bit of background, EVE Online, in comparison to WoW, is a mostly player-driven universe. Now, WoW is a very static universe. You've got a world which pretty much cannot change, and when it does change, it's based on on-off triggers, like the phasing system. It's a binary system of change. It's like, hey, it's changed for me, probably not for everyone else. Things don't really change. You can't own parts of the world. The world stays the same from day to day, whereas EVE, on the other hand, is vastly different. You can own parts of the world, but, you can own pretty much the entire universe, give or take. And it's a much more hardcore experience, although not in such a way that I actually enjoy, I must say. You think it might be the kind of game that I would get along with, but it's not. You can lose an awful lot in that game. You can commit an awful lot to the game, and you can lose things. Whereas in WoW, you can't really lose anything other than a little bit of money and time. And that is appealing to some people, myself included, because I get a little bit too emotionally invested in games like this, and WoW, pisses me off quite a lot. EVE would cause rage way beyond what WoW is capable of doing, and it's not the kind of thing that I want to get involved in. So, you've got a little bit of a background here. Now, EVE runs on a system of corporations, which is the same as our guilds, only they're a lot more complex in what they can do. And corporations can join together in alliances, and these alliances can take ownership of parts of space, and that's called sovereignty within the game. And this gives them various advantages, including various devices that they can put in the space, which makes it incredibly easy to defend, very difficult to take from them, ownership of space stations, super capital ship, construction facilities, towers, all manner of things. Now, there was a big alliance in this game called Band of Brothers. Huge alliance, owned pretty much 80% of the entire universe. Not well liked by a lot of people, because apparently they are a bunch of anally retentive douchebags, so I've been told. And there was another alliance by the name of Goonswarm, and Goonswarm was started from somethingawful.com, as you might expect, from the forums. Or was it eBAM's world? I can't remember which. And they came into the game with the express kind of urge to make a mess of things, because that's what they generally do. When goons go somewhere, they'll go with the aim of causing havoc, and it's a lot of fun. And then a lot of them will stick around in the game, maybe become parts of the community, which is what Goonswarm has become. They initially went in there to make a mess of things, and did, very successfully. And then they became a kind of a proper alliance, although a little bit more laid back than most. Didn't take the game very seriously, because they really don't like people that do that. Now, they actually went to war with Bob a long time ago and did a huge amount of damage to them, like massive amounts. Bob was previously considered to be untouchable, but due to their bees strategy, where they could attack the Band of Brothers with huge numbers of suicide frigates and all manner of other crazy stuff that most other sane alliances wouldn't even begin to fathom. they were actually quite successful. Now, what they caused in the last couple of days, they managed to convince one of the high-level directors to defect. And in doing so, he disbanded the Alliance. Now, what that means, in real terms, is that they gave up sovereignty to 80% of the entire game universe. I.e., 80% of the entire game universe suddenly became the fracking Wild West. And literally, it was open to everyone. It was the biggest online gold rush you have ever seen. They caused absolute total havoc. They turned the world of EVE on its head. And there was a lot of whining about it, but personally I think it's a great achievement. And it demonstrates the power of a dynamic universe. The fact that that could even happen is an amazing feat in itself, and a big step forward, in my opinion, for gaming. Even if there were various kind of dodgy elements to it, and the fact that one person could disband an entire alliance does seem a little bit excessive, but whatever, you've got to admire the achievement. Now, the devs were recently quoted as saying that betrayal and antitrust and stuff like that is a part of the game world. You are apparently not supposed to log in and feel all happy sunflowers and kittens. You are supposed to feel a little bit paranoid, a little bit wary, a little bit depressed when you enter the universe, because it is a cold, hard universe, and that's what it is designed around. And this whole metagaming aspect of it, where you have spies in other people's corporations sabotaging things from within, that's entirely encouraged. It is part of the game. Now, WoW doesn't have any of that at all. Now, looking at it, I've always been a fan of dynamic content and a changing world, and I have indeed gone to great lengths to say so. But I think there is a limit, and I think that the Care Bear nature, quote-unquote, of WoW actually does have its advantages, and I think that's something that we do forget from time to time. I think what made WoW so successful, of course, was the low entry level. Not confusing at all. For instance, I recently logged into a beta of a game that I cannot name due to NDA reasons. It is an MMO that is coming out, and I cannot name it, but you can probably guess. And I was initially entirely confused by it. I logged in and I'm like, what is all this? It was yet another one of those user unfriendly games, from what I could tell. I'm going to delve into it a little bit more over the course of the week, but unlike with WoW, I didn't know what I was doing from the outset. And that is something that puts off a massive number of people, and myself included. I've quit out of all manner of different games within the first 10 minutes of trying them because I couldn't fathom the UI. And I didn't know immediately what I was supposed to do, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm totally confused and lost, let's just not even bother. This is too much commitment. EVE was the same, actually. Now, WoW is a very friendly world in more ways than one. You cannot lose all of your stuff. You cannot be permanently damaged by somebody else. PvP is, while annoying, not permanent. You can't take any permanent damage. There's no player looting, there's no losing of levels or experience, nothing like that. Whereas in, say, EVE Online, you can lose your ship, and if you don't clone your character, you can lose your character. I'm not kidding. You can lose your character and you have to go back to a previous clone of yourself, which may or may not have learnt the skills that your current character, now deceased, had. So yeah, it's a very dynamic world, and WoW isn't. And I think that by not having a dynamic world, you create a safe environment. And a lot of people thrive in that environment. I've been thriving in it for the past 4 years. I don't think you necessarily have to have a dynamic world to make an enjoyable game, and I think Blizzard have proved that. That's not to say that a little bit of dynamic wouldn't be good. I mean, we've seen that they can make a zone involving sieges, for instance. This is the first step they've taken towards really dynamic content. It's like, okay, the faction can own this and gain these benefits. It can actually own a zone, and it changes hands a lot, that being, of course, Wintergrasp. I would like to see that developed a little bit more, but confined. I don't think that having a free-for-all where, hey, you suddenly log into Stormwind, you find it overrun by orcs, would be a particularly good way to go. The EVE Online style of play just simply would not work in WoW, at all. However, restricting it to certain higher level zones, I think would. Allowing factions, and indeed, going even further perhaps, allowing guilds to carve out specific parts of this zone, would be a great idea. You know, I would like to see a battle zone of sorts with certain fortresses that could be owned by guilds, and other guilds will try and take them. It's been done before, to some degree, at any rate, that being with, of course, Warhammer Online. I would like to see it happen, even if it's just like, say, 6 fortresses in this zone, and a guild can own one. You know, maybe limit them to 1 or 2. No more than that. Just say, hey, you can't own more than 2. And have certain benefits for owning them. And have people try and take them back. And perhaps be able to upgrade them. All that kind of thing. The idea of owning something in WoW, I think, well, the reason people get so possessive over their characters and their items is because that's all they've got. They want to make themselves distinctive. They want to feel like they own a piece of the world. And they can't really do that because the world is entirely static. In comparison, of course, EVE Online, you can own an awful lot of things. The problem is, of course, you can have them taken away again. And if there's one thing worse than having the ability not to own anything, particularly in the world, it's having everything you own in the world taken away from you by somebody else. It's an unfriendly style of play. And the community of EVE thrives upon that. And more power to them. I wish I could kind of get into it. Kind of. But I know I wouldn't. I know I wouldn't do so well in that environment. And I know I'd just get incredibly frustrated. Which is why I don't bother with it. Not to say that it's not a good game, because I believe that it is. For some people. Not for all. Now, I think that it's always something that we forget. And we look towards other games and say, hey, this game's so great because all of these things can happen. And that's not really the case. Yes, EVE is cool because this kind of thing can happen. And we've seen similar things, although not quite so extreme, happen in WoW. For instance, remember the Plague? The Plague was like, hey, this is something crazy happening, and it got all over the internet. Heck, it made itself onto the BBC News and all variety of other places. People used it for research projects. I think people do go nuts when that kind of thing happens. I think it's, to be honest, because they are starved for unique events. Whether they be dynamic or static, there have only been very, very few. I think that's something that Blizzard does need to look into. The AQ gate opening, for instance, not the best example of an event done. There were a lot of problems. I don't think gathering 150,000 Peace Bloom was a particularly good idea. But it was a unique event. And it was something that people did gather around, and it was interesting to see, and it allowed people on the realm to compete with each other in a way that was beyond mere PvP and, hey, I killed this boss before you did. And it was interesting because it was a cooperation and a competition at the same time. Now, I think that Blizzard could do well to learn from games like EVE, admittedly not to that extreme. WoW will never be like EVE. WoW will never be an unfriendly game. The problem is, I think, that they're going too far. To the left, or to the right, or up or down, or side to side, whatever you want to call it. Way, way, way too far. They're making the game too easy and too accessible. Which is funny because it never had problems before. Not at all. I certainly never saw any issues with the way that WoW was set up originally. It's like, hey, it's accessible. And once you get to this level, once you've learned the game, once you got into the flow of something, here's something a little bit less accessible. Like, people don't start at level 80. Why do you need to make raids so accessible? I don't understand. So, it would be nice to see WoW take a step in the direction of EVE. Although not too far. Because I think losing the essence of WoW and what made it successful to begin with is, of course, a one-way ticket to disaster. There are plenty of other MMOs that have tried it and failed. They've said, hey, let's take the WoW model and push it a bit further towards EVE. Or any of the other kind of hardcore, dynamic, player-driven games. And they failed. It hasn't worked for them. Star Wars Galaxies being the prime example of what happens when you take a game like that and say, hey, let's move it a little bit closer to WoW. The same thing applies. You move WoW too far towards EVE, WoW will lose what made it great in the first place. But it could certainly stand to learn a few lessons from games that are perhaps more hardcore than WoW will ever be. And certainly more player-driven than WoW will ever be. My name is Tall Biscuit, you listen to Blue Please here on WoW Radio. I've got some tracks, new tracks from Captain Dan. These tracks contain strong language, and you should check out his new album. Yes, indeed. It is already out, in fact, and I believe you can check it out at Non-Existent Records. Let's have a quick look for that, just to see maybe he's changed his music label, who knows. Non-Existent Records, Well, all I can say is go to myspace.com/CaptainDan. Then you will find what you need. Oh yes. This one is ship to ship. This contains strong language. You have been warned. Enjoy.